In 1996, police in New York were sent 4 VHS tapes dated 4 different, consecutive days through July of 1979. These tapes contained recordings of scientific experiments run on 12 human subjects by 2 experimenters, 1 blonde and 1 brunette. What the 10 officers who watched those tapes found shocked them, making 8 physically ill and resulting in the resignation of 4. When asked why she quit, one of those 4 grinned darkly and joked one didn't sign up for this kind of sick shit. The tapes were promptly burned. Neither the sole survivor nor the laboratory could be identified, so no arrests were made. The following is a documentation of what the tapes contained. Tape 1 started simply. The blonde experimenter, wearing a surgical mask and sunglasses, he never removed these when on camera, explained the experiment in a gruff voice. They intended to replicate a psychological experiment from the 50s in which mice were given a bar hooked up via a wire to a needle that was plunged into their skulls. When the bar was pressed, a slight shock was sent to the nucleus accumbens, stimulating the pleasure CENTER degrees. The only difference, of course, was that they intended to perform the experiment on a human scale. They had 4 slightly different trials in store for 3 subjects each. After this explanation and a tour of the testing room, including the 30 cm needle that was to be inserted into the subject's brains, the brown-haired researcher brought in the first test subject, a young man whose name, he announced, was data withheld. He inserted the needle into subject 1's head, the area numbed by gel to minimize pain. However, he made a mistake, the needle was pushed too far. When the subject administered his own electric shock, it stimulated his autonomic system instead, causing a sharp increase in heartbeat, the point that the young man suffered an aneurysm. The needle snapped as he fell and blood sprayed across the floor and onto the opposite wall. He died before the researchers could get to him. After cleaning the room and replacing the needle, the brunette researcher was much more careful. Subject 2, a black man in his 30s known as data withheld, responded as expected to the scenario. After 1 press, he experienced a wave of pleasure. The subject visually shuddered and proceeded to press it again and again and again. This continued for several hours. As with the mice in the original experiment, subject 2 ignored sleep, ignored food, and ignored sex. He disregarded a plate of his favorite pasta, paid no mind to his girlfriend, asking him to make love to her, and at one point soiled himself rather than ask for the bathroom. After over 5 hours, the subject fell to the floor. Researchers noted he had died of exhaustion. Subject 3, a woman in her late 20s, had the same reaction and suffered the same death as subject 2. Tape 1 ends here. What do you think, guys? Should I continue? It gets gorier from here. Ask and you shall receive. Tape 2 kicks off immediately. The blonde researcher explains trial 2, whereas in trial 1 the stimulation stayed constant, in trial 2 it will steadily decrease in strength. The first subject is a Hispanic female, named data withheld. As before, the brunette shows them in, cautiously inserts the needle, and instructs her to press the bar as many times as she wishes. As before, she quickly begins to press it. Over time, as the effect lessens, she becomes distraught. The subject begins yelling at the researchers that the machine is broken. When she is given no reply, she begins bashing the bar violently, shattering the bones in her hands, resulting in numerous compound fractures. Her arms continue to flail against the bar, the sick cracking of her radius and all now audible to the viewers of the recordings. Eventually, she passes out. Subject 5, another Hispanic female, responded similarly, even yelling in Portuguese at one point. Subject 6, a middle-aged Caucasian male, smashed his hands against a bar until the flesh broke. He forcibly tore his hands from his wrists with his teeth in frustration and screamed that the researchers have to fix the fucking machine or else. He soon bled out. The blonde researcher revealed at the end that subjects 4 and 5 also bled to death after being removed from the testing room. Tape 2 then ends. Tape 3, following the established pattern, documented all of trial 3. The blonde again explained the experiment. Once again the charge would change over time, but this time, it would start weak and grow steadily stronger. Trial 3 was perhaps the most precise trial. Of the 3 subjects, a white male, data withheld, a black female, data withheld, and an Asian male, data withheld, all gave almost exactly the same reaction. Each subject pressed the bar first with no result. They continued pressing with idle curiosity or the researchers' insistence until they felt the effects of the shock, at which point they pressed it over and over with reckless abandon. All three started groaning in what was undoubtedly pain after a time, but they kept pressing the bar. Their groans turned to moans, turned to yelps until finally they died from a finally lethal shock. This pattern persisted for all three. The only break to the pattern was subject 9, data withheld, who, after the final press that would be the one to kill him, stared at the camera recording his test and laughed manically for 3 straight minutes until his body finally gave out. The blonde noted a scent like cooked ham in the test area. Tape 3 ends here. It is worth noting that one of the 10 officers watching the tapes had to leave to puke. He left just in time. Tape 4 was the most horrific of them all. The blonde researcher explained that the bar was programmed to give an electric shock just like in trial 1. However, after 50,000 shocks, the bar would stop delivering the stimulation. The researcher seemed most excited for this one. Tape 4 was the most horrific of them all. The blonde researcher explained that the bar was programmed to give an electric shock just like in trial 1. However, after 50,000 shocks, the bar would stop delivering the stimulation. The researcher seemed most excited for this one. The brunette brought in subject 10, a white female of 20 named data withheld. She behaved like every other subject, hitting the bar rapidly. After 93 minutes, the 50,000 mark was reached and the pleasure stopped coming. She was enraged. Data withheld began pounding on the bar, screaming that the machine wasn't working. When her calls went unanswered, she started clawing at her face. Skin was peeled off, exposing her facial muscles. Before long, the woman had torn off her entire face, still shrieking at the top of her lungs. The brunette researcher cleaned her dead body up. When he finished, he stared at the bar until his comrade called his name. The 11th subject was a Hispanic man named Data Withheld. He too behaved as expected at first. At the 85-minute mark, the stimulation cut off. For a while he stared at the bar, pressing it again periodically to test that it still did not work. He seemed dejected, sat on the floor, and cried for 2 minutes. Then he began screaming loudly and furiously. He grabbed the needle in his head and forced it farther in, then pulled it up, then pushed it back in, over and over, screaming, "I need to feel it again. I need to feel it again." Finally he slumped over, dead, his brains and blood on most of the test room. Again, the brunette cleans it. Again, he stares at the bar for a moment. A Caucasian female made the 12th and final subject. It took her 95 minutes to reach 50,000. When she did, she kept hitting it for 10 more minutes. One officer still viewing noted that it was like she was in a trance. After that she stopped, pulled the needle slowly from her head, and simply stood there, bleeding slightly but alive. Calmly, precisely, her movements controlled, she began forcing the 30 centimeters needle through her pants and up her genitals, all the way up, until it was no longer visible. She did not make a sound, as if it did not hurt her. She then jumped and landed on her butt in a cross-legged seating position. The needle had been forced farther up, at an angle, and now stabbed through her lower back. All the while she remained silent. When the brunette researcher entered 3 minutes later, he found she was already cold. He began cleaning the mess. At this point the video went black, as if the tape ended abruptly. After 5 minutes it kicked in again. The brunette researcher is in the test room, now clean again. The needle is in his head. He presses the bar and immediately seizes up. The needle stimulated his heartbeat, giving him an aneurysm. He falls to the floor, twitching, as the blonde researcher enters the room, wearing his sunglasses and surgery mask as always. He lifts a gun and shoots his fellow experimenter 3 times. He then aims at the camera and shoots it. Tape 4 finally ends. A search of missing persons in New York at the time the videos were recorded gave no results matching any of the 12 men and women in the tapes. A more thorough search of all the citizens on America at the time found nobody whose names matched the respective sexes and races of the people in the tapes. It was as if the subjects never existed. The tapes were said to be a forgery in the final report. No news stations were notified. No investigation was conducted. The case was officially closed on September 12, 13 days after the tapes were received. Well, there we go, the end. What did X think?